This week we're going to extend our discussion of living organisms to include this unit of life called the cell. And if you remember at the beginning of the semester, we first began by looking at very small particles called subatomic particles, things like neutrons, protons, electrons, and looking at how they fit together to make atoms. Then we went to the next level of complexity and looked at how atoms bond together to create molecules. Now we're going to look at the next level of complexity, which is how molecules join together to coordinate their functions in order to create this thing called a cell. In this first part of our lecture this week, I'm going to very briefly discuss something called the cell theory and some of the tenets of the cell theory, and then I'm going to quickly talk about a little bit about why cells are so tiny. So first things first, a cell, by definition in biology, is the smallest unit of living matter. In other words, I cannot divide a cell up into smaller pieces and have it still be a living organism. The cell is the smallest you can get and still have something that retains all the properties of a living organism. Now, cells were not discovered or described until the 1700s, when several different researchers in Europe began making very primitive versions of what today we call microscopes. And it was with these primitive microscopes that they were, individuals such as Van Leeuwenhoek were first able to see the individual cells inside of plants way back in the 1700s. And that launched a whole new frontier of research in the sciences, in biology, to understand what these units were, these cells were, what were the parts that made up a cell, what were cells used for, what kind of activities did they perform. It really launched an entirely new understanding of living organisms. And out of all of the research that was done using microscopes to explore cells and find out about their properties, several common themes arose time and time again, and these became the cornerstones or the tenets of the cell theory. The cell theory is just a collection of statements which we know apply to all cells. First of all, we know that all living organisms on planet Earth are made up of cells. Some living organisms are made up of a single cell. These we call unicellular organisms, and other organisms are made up of multiple cells. We call them multicellular organisms. Secondly, cells are the smallest unit of living matter. As I said previously, I cannot cut a cell up into smaller pieces and still have something that retains all the properties of living organisms. Therefore, a cell is the smallest unit of living matter. Thirdly, cells come from pre-existing cells. Cells do not just spontaneously pop out of thin air. Now back in the 17 and 1800s and even prior to that, some people really did believe in this thing called spontaneous generation, which was this idea that things could appear out of nothing, such as, if a farmer leaves a bag of grain in the corner of a farmhouse and comes back a week later and sees mice in that grain bag, he would think, oh gee, the seeds spontaneously gave rise to mice. And we know that's not true. But that was an important tenet for them to come through with the cell theory, was to realize that cells come from pre-existing cells. And lastly, if cells come from pre-existing cells, then cells have to be self-reproducing. Cells have to have the ability to reproduce copies of themselves. So those are sort of the basic tenets or cornerstones of the cell theory. These are things that we know are true of all cells. Another thing that's true of all cells is they all have molecules inside of them that are there to perform specific tasks for the cell. And we're going to talk about those a little bit later on in another part of this week's lecture. Before we move on to talking about that, though, I want to just spend a minute and discuss a little bit about why it is that cells are so tiny. most cells, as you know, cannot be seen with the naked eye. There are a few exceptions. For example, a human egg cell, you can actually barely see it with the naked eye, but it's incredibly tiny. However, most cells you have to use a microscope to see them at all. The reason why cells are so small has to do with the surface area of the cell versus its volume. Volume, remember, is the amount of space that a cell takes up. Surface area is what is the outer coating, how big is the outer coating. So if we were to look at this cube, if we added up the area of all the sides of the cube, that would give us the surface area, and the amount of space contained within that cube would be the volume. What's interesting about this is that if we imagine that this cube here is a cell, remember that a cell needs to get nutrients from its environment. It needs to get oxygen, it needs to get vitamins, it needs to get sugar molecules, etc. from its external environment into the cell. So the outermost coating of the cell, something that we call the plasma membrane, which we learned about last week, is the barrier between the external environment and the internal volume of the cell. And it turns out that you have to have a certain amount of plasma membrane in order for there to be enough room for things to pass or diffuse through that plasma membrane and get into the internal part of the cell to support living function in that cell. If I have a cell that's really big, the amount of volume inside that cell compared to its surface area is too large. There's too much stuff inside to be supported by the relatively small amount of plasma membrane outside. So the surface area is too small to support the volume inside. Now if I were to cut that cell up into 8 cubes of smaller size, I still have too much volume compared to the surface area to support living activities inside that cell. I could cut it up even smaller into 64 cubes, and guess what? I still need to have a much greater amount of surface area to volume in order for me to be able to actually sustain cellular activities. So cells are small because they have to be. A large cell would not be able to get sufficient amount of nutrients and oxygen, etc., into the cell to support all the different activities happening inside that cell. So ultimately what you need to have is a high surface area to volume ratio. That means that you have to have a lot of surface area relative to a small amount of volume inside the surface area in order for living activities to be sustained over any long-term period of time.